This morning we're continuing our Asked BBC GMS series where you can put your questions about coronavirus to our trusted experts. This morning we're joined by the virologist Dr. Chris Smith, aka the Naked Scientist, and David Martyn, who's an employment lawyer and partner at Thompsons solicitors. They'll be with us for the next half hour. So get in touch with your questions. The text is 80295, the email goodmorningscotland@bbc.co.uk, or you can use the hashtag AskBBCGMS on social media. Let's talk to both of you now. Good morning, Dr. Chris and David. How are you?
Morning, I'm good. Did David realise we're doing a role reversal for a twist in the programme today? I'm going to do the employment questions, he's doing the medical ones.
He can't wait. I can sense that on the line now. And
I can hear the terror in his voice.
Yeah, we did introduce you as trusted experts, so let's not do that. Chris, we've heard a lot this morning on the programme about the Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, talking about the fact that there haven't been as many cases, and he believes this lockdown is working. Is it too early to know?
Well, he was quite cautious in how he presented the information at the press conference, because if you listen to some other coverage before he stood up to speak, people were saying, well, look, the numbers, do look a bit encouraging. And Neil Ferguson from Imperial College said there's evidence that there is a bit of a shift in some parts of the country. But Patrick Vallance did say, look, we need to wait a little while longer because we're not going to know, because we're monitoring, for instance, death rate, and that's unarguable when we've got a death because of coronavirus, and we can extrapolate backwards to how many cases that must have been there to cause those deaths, because we know roughly how many people who get it then die of it. So at the moment, because we've only just introduced these measures and there's a very long incubation and period up to getting really ill with this, what we're doing now we won't feel the benefit of for at least another couple of weeks. So it's probably too early to say for sure, but certainly we're optimistic.
Well, let's get some questions in from the listeners to you. We've had a text. Will UK passengers be tested for COVID-19 when they return to the UK, to UK airports? Because we hear that they're being brought back now. If they're not being tested, why not?
OK, at the very outset of all of this, when Britain had very low levels of this virus, it made sense to test people coming from areas where there was a lot of activity to an area where there was no activity, because that was a way in which we could slow down or even stamp out the introduction of the virus to the country. But we now acknowledge, and the data presented yesterday suggests there's probably close to 2 million people in the UK have been infected now. So this is a relatively high circulating area. So if you're bringing people from one area where the virus is circulating to another area where the virus is circulating, you're not really going to make a difference. If you think of it in sort of, if I took some hot water from one bucket and poured it into a bucket at the same temperature, it's not going to change anything. It's not like adding a load of hot water to a load of cold water. So there's not really any merit at this stage of the outbreak to test people coming home.
David, let's talk a little bit about employment, because we're having to learn a whole new vocabulary with this pandemic. Social distancing, self-isolating, and furloughed is a word that many people will be hearing for the first time. Can you just explain to us what that means in the employment context?
I think it's interesting, Gary. Furloughing is actually a new concept entirely for employment lawyers as well. It's not something which, until this crisis, existed at all. In fact, the concept of the government stepping in and paying the wages of individual employees was a concept which, if you'd mentioned it a month ago, would have just been utterly inconceivable. What the government has done, they haven't finalised the provisions yet. They haven't put in place the website where you can apply to recover these wages, but effectively the principles are that the government will pay up to 80% of the salaries of workers who can no longer do their jobs as a result of the restrictions which are in place. Now, there's a lot of details in this scheme to be worked out, and you can imagine it has been produced at breakneck speed, so we are not sure of exactly how it's going to operate, but we imagine what is going to happen is employers will be asked to identify those employees who they just think can no longer perform their duties because of the social distancing measures and because of closures of businesses. They will be asked to identify who those individuals are. They will be asked to identify how much they think it's costing them in terms of salary to continue to pay those individuals, and they'll then be able to make a payment or make a request to the government for the government to pay them a grant of 80% of those individuals' wages.
And that obviously should be passed on to the individual. But in terms of people themselves being furloughed, Margaret asks, I've been offered a short-term job in a supermarket. Am I allowed to work for the days I would not have been working when I've been furloughed?
We think that's very unlikely. You will be able to do, and there's an express provision in the guidance to say that you will be able to do volunteer work. So we know there's a huge number of new volunteering opportunities available all the time at the moment, and you will expressly be able to do volunteer work, but we cannot imagine circumstances where you'd be allowed to do other paid work during a period when you've been furloughed, because effectively you are being paid for your existing job.
We've had another text about that, though, that says, I have been furloughed. Can I work on my days off? So if you weren't working for a company for 2 days a week, could you go off and do something else in the meantime?
That's an interesting question. I think it's something you would want to discuss with your employer in the first instance. If you had an existing, if you had 2 or 3 existing jobs already, then there's no reason why you can't be furloughed from one job and continue in the other 2 jobs. Whether you should be taking up a new job is a question that is not one that's been answered by the legislation to date. I think you should definitely be speaking to your employer, because your employer or your employment contract will probably contain a provision which says that if you're going to take a new job up, you need to tell them about that first. So by all means, explore that opportunity, but I would be speaking to your your existing employer first.
Chris, so we'll come back to the health issue here, the whole issue of quarantine and, self-isolation, etc. People may be a little bit confused. This from Suzanne in Kirkcudbright, who says, my 20-year-old is at university. He stayed at university. He and his flatmates decided they would stay together. Only 2 are left now. Suzanne says, for the past 14 days, he's had no symptoms. Neither have I or my 14-year-old daughter. Her question is, if my son comes home, it'll be a 2-hour drive home. Does he need to be in total isolation for 7 days when he gets here, if all 3 of us are symptom-free?
I would argue probably not, but this is not really in what we're dubbing the spirit of this. The whole intention of this legislation is to try to cut down the transmission of this virus by preventing households mixing. So being in his digs with another housemate, that's regarded as a household. If he then comes home, he is potentially sort of going between 2 households. Now, if you did that once and you said this is a definitive move and that's the end of it, then I think that would be acceptable. And the fact is that they're considering the risk profile because neither of them have got symptoms. So the risk is very, very small, and there's no need to isolate further when you get home. But one should bear in mind that this is going contrary to what we're trying to achieve here, which is to try to stop people moving, and you should really have done that right at the outset. But I don't think anyone would be that concerned if you said, well, look, for practical reasons, I haven't got any symptoms, family haven't got any symptoms, everyone's been in isolation for the past period anyway, therefore we're just going to move once and that's it.
Yeah, this goes back to, I think, the advice that was given by one of the medical officials in England a few days ago when asked about couples, whether, if you don't live together, how much time can you spend together? And I think her advice was, well, you either have to separate and test the relationship or move in together.
That's what she said. It was Jenny Harries, who's the Chief Medical Officer's deputy, and she said, yes, I think under these circumstances it may well be time to test the strength of your relationship. And then when pressed further, she said, well, that means you either move in together and test the strength of your relationship, or you stay apart and test the strength of your relationship. Either way, it's in the spirit of the idea, which is trying to stop us moving between households, because that is how the virus transmits. And if we distance ourselves, this is not just a social distance, it's a metaphorical distance as well, because this virus can be regarded as a bit like a relay race at the now cancelled Olympics, where the virus is the baton, and we've got people handing it from one to the next. We want to make the distance between the runners such that they can't pass that baton on, it gets dropped, that's a breaking of the chain of the transmission.
Chris, one quick one here. I think you might have answered it, but it's difficult for people who have older relatives relying on them. This text says, can I drive from the Highlands to the Central Belt to help my 90-year-old mother out and plan her help over the next few weeks? I would then want to return north after a few days. Would that be allowed?
Well, different police forces are taking different views on this, but the thing is, you've got to use common sense here, and you've got to consider, well, if you don't do this, who is going to look after your elderly relative? And if no one is going to, then arguably the people we're trying to protect are people like the elderly relative, and if they end up worse off through us going so far in trying to protect them that we don't actually protect them, then that's arguably worse. So one has to use a common sense approach, and if you are the sole person who's going to sort out and put in place provision for that person's care, I'd say that's a very justified case. Make sure, though, that when you do this, that you go once, you don't go and infect them with something. So if you have any symptoms, definitely don't go. And once you've sorted everything out, put in place a sustainable plan so you don't have to make these sorts of movements again, unless you are going to be the sole carer for that person, in which case they're absolutely dependent upon you, and then that's a totally different ballgame.
OK, we'll keep your questions coming. 80295, health questions or anything around employment law. You can also use the hashtag AskBBCGMS. The time, 12 minutes to 9. This morning's news headlines. Shoppers spent nearly £2 billion more in Britain's supermarkets in the 4 weeks to mid-March than they did over the same period last year. The UK's Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, says that although coronavirus cases are still rising, they're not climbing as fast as feared. And MSPs will debate further coronavirus measures for Scotland later. The new laws will form the largest piece of emergency legislation since Holyrood was formed.
If you need a bit of escapism, we've got you covered.
With plenty of great music and conversation to keep you entertained.
And if any news breaks, we'll keep you informed so you don't miss a thing.
We'll be capturing the mood across the country, hearing some of the positive stories coming out of your communities about what people are doing to help, and looking at what else can be done.
We're inviting you to get involved.
Of course, we'll cover changes in the world of arts.
And look at different ways to enjoy yourself or pass the time in your home.
Perhaps we'll all learn something new.
The Afternoon Show, back today from 1:30 on BBC Radio Scotland.
And you're listening to Good Morning Scotland, where we are asking the experts your questions. We have with us this morning Dr. Chris Smith, the naked scientist, and David Martyn, who's an employment lawyer and partner at Thompsons Solicitors, who's very definitely not naked this morning. David, I want to come to you because we've done some stuff on health and spread of virus. We talked earlier about furloughing, and it is something that keeps coming up again and again and again. We've had texts from Paul and tweets from Jamie Lee and Gil Bird. Please, can you ask about the 28th of February cut-off date for the 80% assistance from the UK government? Thousands of seasonal workers who were due to start at the beginning of April have fallen foul of this. What is this?
Yeah, so the 28th of February is the date when the government has said if somebody was on a PAYE system in a workplace, then you can make a claim in respect of that individual. So you have to be registered with PAYE as at the 28th of February to be somebody who is potentially eligible to be furloughed. Now, one of the questions which arises is, let's say somebody in the context of, for example, a seasonal worker who only becomes employed, let's say tomorrow, 1st of April, there'll be a lot of employees starting on that date. Can the employer make a claim in respect of a grant for that employee if there was a real intention and there was a documented evidence that this individual was due to start on the 1st of April? Can they start that person as an employee on the 1st of April and then immediately put them on furlough? Now, that question has not been resolved yet, but we believe that if you can demonstrate evidentially that there was a clear intention to start them on the 1st of April, then you can probably start them on the 1st of April and apply for a furlough grant immediately. Now, that has a real potential for abuse, as you can imagine, because we could simply see employers employing family members and individuals who they had absolutely no intention of employing whatsoever, simply to get these people a wage, effectively.
Yeah, can I jump in just there and ask a specific question? Because Paul says, well, I work for this company, I worked for them all last year, but they get laid off at the end of the year. So if he can show earnings from last year, could that help in his favour? Again,
I think it would be evidentially quite helpful if HMRC were to challenge the grant. And I think one of the difficulties may be actually for employers. It's really about employers being comfortable taking these people on into their roles because they have to bring them into these new jobs. It's about employers being comfortable that they will be entering into a contractual obligation to pay these employees a certain amount of money. Now, it's a bit of a risk for the employer to take those people on not knowing whether the government is actually going to cover the wage, because if the government doesn't cover the wage, then the employee could come after the employer for the full salary which was paid during the period of furlough.
Let's go back to health then. Anne in Menstrie, Chris, about symptoms. And I think, again, a lot of people will be asking these kinds of questions. Anne says, I'm fairly sure I've had the virus since the 17th of March. Do we know enough yet to say what the trajectory of symptoms is and how long recovery time is?
Hello, Anne. Well, the answer is we're still learning, but the usual pattern is that the incubation period runs from as short as 1 day, that's the shortest documented time we have on record, to as long as 11 days. We're using 14 days because that gives us a safety window, because there's always uncertainty about when people really caught something, or, when they might have remembered or misremembered. So we use 14 days as a safety. After about that time, and the average time for symptoms to kick in is about 5 days, people then initially develop usually a fever, often a cough, but not exclusively, and then they progress over the week. So another 7 days goes by with worsening of those symptoms, and then usually people either recover and then they just feel a bit clapped out, and they often say they've got a persistent cough that goes on, takes a little while to settle down, but they're not feverish, and at that point you can regard yourself as non-infectious and able to return to society, as it were, back to work if you're at work and so on. But if you remain feverish, you shouldn't. If you are not in that category, you may continue to see a deterioration in your symptoms, and after about 7 days of deteriorating symptoms, then people are regarded as more severely ill often, and if they end up in hospital, it's usually another 7 days before they are, in ITU or possibly even going to die. So hopefully you're not on that end of the spectrum, but that's the usual pattern. So it may take as long as a month from a person contracting the virus to succumbing to it.
And a couple of quick questions about how long this virus lives. And we're all being told to wash our hands, obviously, and that is one of the vital things here. But a couple of questions saying, do we know how long the virus lives on fabric? Should I wipe down my shopping? Another texter says, could the virus live on food packaging in the freezer, or might cold actually preserve the virus or kill it?
Right, this has been looked at. There's a group in the US who have actually done the experiments now where they put known amounts of virus onto a surface, and then they waited a certain period of time, and then they came along and swabbed the surface and then tested whether they could infect cells in a dish to prove that the virus must have been viable on that surface after that amount of time. And they did this on plastics, metals, materials, paper and cardboard. It looks like it stays around in the air for about 3 hours. So if you put virus particles into the air, you can still recover infective virus in the air for at least 3 hours. On surfaces, plastic, 3 days. Steel surfaces, 3 days. Paper and cardboard, up to 3 days. Now, that shows how long it remains viable for, but what it doesn't tell you is there's an infectious dose there. And this is a subtle distinction, but just because there's a virus there, and if you give it an optimum chance to infect some cells, it can, that's not the same as what happens in real life when you touch a surface, pick up some virus, and then potentially transfer it to your eyes or your nose or your mouth. There may not well be an infectious dose on that surface. But if you want to be doubly sure, best thing to do is shopping and so on. Unpack the shopping, take the things out of cardboard boxes, perhaps decant your cereals into plastic containers or something, throw away the packaging, wash your hands. Everyone's a winner.
Can I just ask David just one last question? Sure. It's a question from Stevie very specifically about colleges, but I think it'll affect a lot of people. Stevie says colleges are now telling staff they can't cancel their booked annual leave. Many think this is the last thing they need at this moment in time and want to move their leave to the summer when they may be able to do something with it. It seems opportunistic and unfair for them not to be allowed to cancel it. What do you think?
Okay, I think there's a couple of points to make in relation to annual leave. First of all, your employer can force you to take a period of annual leave. So even if you cancel your annual leave, as long as your employer gives you twice the notice of the period of annual leave, so if you're taking a week's annual leave, they have to give you 2 weeks' notice, that they are insisting that you take a period of annual leave. So they can force you to take annual leave, and we will see a lot of employers doing that, especially when people are on furlough. However, if you're an essential, necessary service and you can't, so if we're talking here of somebody working in health, somebody working in food distribution, the government has indicated they're going to change the law in terms of how many days of annual leave you can carry over for up to 2 years. So there's going to be a new piece of legislation that comes in place, meaning that if you cannot take your full annual leave in a leave year, you would normally use it or lose it. The government's now saying, well, actually, you don't have to lose it. If you have to work because you're working an essential service and it's not reasonably practicable for you to take that leave, then you can carry that leave on for up to 2 years. So I think the government has recognised there's an issue here, particularly in people who are going to have to work extraordinarily long hours at the moment and whose leave may be cancelled because they're doing vital work. So there has been a change, but I think for most people, unfortunately, your employer does have the right to sort of cancel your leave and insist that you take some.
Thank you very much indeed. David Martyn there, employment lawyer and partner at Thompsons Solicitor. And before that, we heard from Dr. Chris Smith. And thank you to you for sending all those questions in.